The call came at 4:47 in the morning, and Mara Linden almost didn't answer it. She was already in her car, already exhausted in that specific way that only 12-hour night shifts in a pediatric ICU can make a person, the kind of tired that sits behind your eyes and presses. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. She glanced at the screen, unknown number, Ontario area code. She let it ring twice, then picked up. Is this Mara Linden, registered nurse, sick kids, Toronto? Yes. Who is this? Constable Hendricks, OPP. We need you to come in. She didn't understand at first. She asked him to repeat himself. He did, slower, with the particular patience of someone who had rehearsed this speech and was not going to deviate from it. There had been an incident involving a former patient. They had questions. It wasn't a request. She drove to the detachment office on AW 400 with her hands steady on the wheel and her stomach in her throat. She didn't know yet that the call itself had been a trap. Mara had grown up in Sudbury, the daughter of a paramedic father and a nurse mother, and she had never once in her 31 years thought of herself as the kind of person things happened to. She was the person who responded when things happened to other people. She had done 2 tours embedded with a Canadian Armed Forces medical unit in Latvia, not combat technically, but close enough that she'd triaged soldiers brought in from live fire exercises, held hands while boys from Moncton cried for their mothers, learned how to keep her voice level when her hands were not. She'd come back to Toronto with a limp from a vehicle rollover outside Riga and a referral to a physio she still saw every second Thursday. The limp was better now, mostly. On cold mornings it wasn't. This was November. This was a cold morning. She parked in the visitor lot of the OPP detachment and sat for a moment with the engine idling. The fluorescent lights above the entrance buzzed faintly. She checked her phone. No callback number for Constable Hendricks, no badge number offered, nothing she could verify. But she was already there. She turned off the engine and got out. The officer who met her at the front desk was not Hendricks. He was younger, maybe 25, with a jaw like a geographic feature and the manner of someone who had recently been told he had authority and was still getting used to it. His nameplate said Calloway. He looked her up and down. He did not offer his hand. You're the nurse? I'm Mara Linden. Yes, I spoke with a Constable Hendricks on the phone. He's unavailable. I'll be handling your statement. He led her back through a door that required a key card, and she noticed the door did not open from the inside without one. Small thing. She noticed it anyway. The room he put her in was not an interview room in the way she'd imagined. No two-way mirror. Just a table, 3 chairs, a camera mounted in the upper corner. He told her to sit. She sat. He placed a manila folder on the table but did not open it. Are you familiar with a Marcus Webb, former patient, admitted to sick kids approximately 14 months ago? I care for a lot of patients. This one would be memorable. 11 years old. Cardiac event during admission. There's a complaint filed suggesting the nursing staff on duty delayed intervention. She went very still. I was the nursing staff on duty, she said. I initiated the code. I did chest compressions for 6 minutes until the crash team arrived. Marcus Webb went home 3 weeks later. Calloway looked at her the way people look at a lock they think they've already picked. That's one version, he said. She asked for a lawyer at the end of the first hour. Calloway told her she wasn't under arrest, that she was free to leave at any time, that this was just a conversation. The words sounded reasonable. The keycard door suggested otherwise. She asked again. He said it wasn't that kind of situation. She thought about her father, who had told her once that the phrase "you're free to leave" is most dangerous, precisely when the person saying it doesn't mean it. She stayed, because she had nothing to hide, and because leaving felt like admitting something she hadn't done. Later, she would understand that this calculation, the reasonable person's calculation, the honest person's calculation, was exactly what someone had counted on. By the second hour, Calloway had been joined by a second officer whose name she never caught, a man in plain clothes who introduced himself only as working with the Crown's office. He was the one who opened the folder. Inside were printed pages. She recognized them: patient charts, internal memos, shift logs. But the timestamps were wrong. She could see it from across the table. Her initial assessment note, timestamped 2214, the code initiation she'd logged, showing 2231. 17 minutes. In the original chart, it had been 4. Someone had altered the records. She said this out loud, her voice flat and exact, the voice she used when she was telling a family their child had a difficult road ahead. The plainclothes man wrote something down. Calloway looked at the wall. "Those are the records we received," he said. "Those records are wrong, M's." Linden, Nurse Linden. She was not angry. She was something colder than angry, and she had learned in Latvia that cold was more useful. "Those records have been altered. I have my personal notes from that shift. I have my phone, which has a text I sent to the charge nurse at 22:18 about the patient's deteriorating vitals. I'd like to call someone. Your phone needs to stay here." She looked at him. "For documentation purposes," he said. She looked at him a while longer. Then she reached into the pocket of her jacket. Her personal phone, not the work phone she'd already surrendered at the desk, and before Calloway could react, she pressed dial. Her sister picked up on the second ring. She had 6 seconds before Calloway crossed the room. In 6 seconds, she said, "OPP detachment, Highway 400, Mira, call Dad and tell him to call Terrence. They've got my work phone and I need someone here now." Then the phone was out of her hand and Calloway was telling her she couldn't do that. And she was nodding, very calm, the way she'd nodded when a senior officer in Riga told her she shouldn't be that close to the perimeter. She had been right then, too. Terrence Dube had been her father's lawyer for 20 years and had spent a third of that career on police oversight cases. He arrived 40 minutes later, which meant Mira had reached him in under 5 minutes, which meant her sister had understood immediately what 6 words in a controlled voice meant. The moment Terrence walked through the front door of the detachment, the temperature in the building changed. She felt it before she saw him. A shift in the officer's posture, a pause in Calloway's steady rotation in and out of the room. Then Terrence was there, silver-haired and unhurried, setting his briefcase on the table with a small, precise click. "Constable Calloway," he said, reading the nameplate. "I'm Terrence Dube. I'll need 5 minutes alone with my client, after which point this interview concludes unless you intend to charge her, and if you intend to charge her, I'd like to see the documentation that supports that. All of it, including whatever was in that folder." Calloway said something about process. Terrence said, very pleasantly, "Of course." When they were alone, Mara put her hands flat on the table and breathed. "The records are altered," she told him. 17 minutes where there were 4. "I have a text from that night that proves it. On your personal phone, they took it. But it's backed up to the cloud. Mira has my login." Terrence nodded slowly. "All right." He looked at her with the directness of someone who had been in many rooms like this one. "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer carefully. Is there anyone at that hospital with a reason to want this complaint to stand?" She thought about it. Really thought, not reflexively. There was a name. She didn't say it yet, but there was a name. The name was Daniel Voss. He was the administrative director of the pediatric unit, a position he'd held for 3 years, and in those 3 years, he'd developed a reputation for 2 things: thorough documentation audits and personal animosity toward nurses who filed incident reports outside the chain of command. Mara had filed 2. The first, 14 months ago, was a report about inadequate staffing during the very shift when Marcus Webb coded. The second was filed 3 months after that, when she discovered that her first report had been quietly removed from the internal system. She had not told anyone at the hospital about the second report. She had filed it directly with the College of Nurses of Ontario and kept a copy on a personal drive at home. She told Terrence all of this in the small room while Calloway waited outside. Terrence listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The altered records in that folder," he said, "do they originate from the hospital system? They'd have to. I don't have access to the master records, only to my own notes. So someone with administrator-level access would have to have done it, yes." He tapped his pen against his notepad once. "Then what we have," he said, "is not a complaint against you. What we have is evidence of a crime, and you are sitting in the wrong building." They released her at 9 a.m., not because Calloway was satisfied. He wasn't, or didn't seem to be, or perhaps had received instructions from the plainclothes man that Mara wasn't privy to. They released her because Terrence had made 3 phone calls in the hallway and returned with a stillness that indicated the calls had gone well. They gave back her work phone. Her personal phone, Calloway said, was still being processed. She didn't argue. It was already irrelevant. Outside, the November air hit her face, and she stood still for a moment, looking at the parking lot, at the pale gray sky above the highway, at the cars moving past at highway speed without stopping. The world had continued to exist while she was in that room. She found this, briefly, difficult to absorb. Her father was waiting by her car. He was 63 years old and had worked 28 years in emergency services, and he had driven 2 hours from Sudbury without being asked. He put his arms around her and didn't say anything for a moment, which was exactly right. "Terence says you did well," he said. "I was scared," she said. "Yeah." He stepped back and looked at her, the way he'd looked at her after the rollover call from Riga, the way he'd looked at her when she was 7 years old and had broken her wrist falling off the garage roof. Taking inventory, making sure the important parts were still there. "You still did well." What followed was not fast. Justice in the movies moves in 3-act time. Justice in Ontario moves through the College of Nurses, the Ontario Civilian Police Commission, the Trillium Health Records Oversight Board, and several interagency information requests that require specific forms filed in specific orders. But it moved. The cloud backup of her personal phone produced the text message, timestamp 2218 on the night in question, reading, "Marcus in Bay 4 looks wrong to me, BP dropping, I'm flagging Reyes now." Reyes was the charge nurse. He had his own records. His records matched hers. The hospital's IT forensic team, engaged by the college after Terence filed an external complaint, found evidence of record modification in the master system. The modification had been made from an administrator account. The account belonged to Daniel Voss. What the forensic team also found, buried in the audit trail, was that Voss had accessed the records on 3 separate occasions. Once when Mara filed her original incident report, once 2 weeks after she'd filed with the college, and once 12 days before Calloway called her at 4:47 in the morning. He had been watching and adjusting the way people adjust things when they believe no one is watching back. He had miscalculated, badly. The hearing before the nursing college's discipline panel was held on a Wednesday in February in a building near King and Bay that smelled of photocopier toner and institutional coffee. Mara arrived early and sat outside the hearing room with her hands folded in her lap, watching the other people move through the corridor. Some of them looked at her. A few of them she recognized from the unit, colleagues who had submitted voluntary statements, most of them in her favor. The hearing itself was not dramatic in the way courtroom proceedings are dramatic on television. It was methodical. Evidence was presented. Witnesses were questioned. Terence was precise and unemotional and very effective. The panel chair was a woman named Dr. Kwan, 60-something with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and an expression that suggested she had seen every version of this story and was reserving judgment until she'd seen all the evidence. Mara liked her immediately. When it was Mara's turn to speak, she did not dramatize. She walked Dr. Kwan and the panel through the night of November 7th, 14 months ago. She described Marcus Webb's vitals at 22:11. She described the decision she'd made at 22:14 to begin continuous monitoring. She described the text she'd sent to Reyes at 22:18. She described initiating the code at 22:19 after the second BP reading. She described 6 minutes of chest compressions with her bad leg aching on the linoleum floor. She described Marcus Webb at discharge, standing in the hallway in a Toronto Maple Leafs t-shirt, giving her a hug that was too tight because he was 11 and didn't know his own strength. The panel was very quiet. Afterward, in the corridor, one of her colleagues, a nurse named Patricia who had been on the unit for 22 years, found her and hugged her without saying anything. Then she pulled back and said, "You know what bothers me most? He would have just kept going. If your backup hadn't been those cloud files, if your sister hadn't called Terence." "But she did," Mara said, "I know. But what about the nurses who don't have a Terence?" Mara didn't have an answer for that then. She thought about it for a long time afterward. The findings, when they came, were unambiguous. The panel found no evidence of nursing negligence or delayed intervention in the care of Marcus Webb. They found substantial evidence that internal hospital records had been falsified after the fact. They referred the matter to the Ontario Securities Commission for the hospital's governance implications and to the Crown Attorney's Office for potential criminal charges related to document fraud and obstruction. Daniel Voss resigned 2 days before the panel's findings were formally released. His resignation was accompanied by a statement from the hospital's board that contained 7 paragraphs of careful non-language. Mara read it once and set it down. Constable Calloway was the subject of a separate review by the Ontario Civilian Police Commission. The review found that his conduct during Mara's interview, including the retention of her personal phone, the failure to clearly indicate the voluntary nature of the interview, and the presence of a third party identifying himself as working with the Crown's office, who had not been formally introduced, fell below the standard expected of OPP officers. He received a formal reprimand and was required to complete additional training in interview procedures and civilian rights. It was not enough. Mara knew it wasn't enough. Terence knew it. Her father, when he read the report, went quiet in a way she recognized. But the record existed now. The paper existed. The next person who sat in that room with a keycard door would have a record to point to. She held on to that. 6 months after the hearing, the hospital convened a task force on administrative oversight of incident reports. Mara was invited to sit on it. She accepted. It met on Tuesday evenings in a boardroom on the 4th floor, and it was full of people arguing in good faith about systems and accountability and what safeguards actually look like when they're functioning. And it was often frustrating and always slow, and she showed up every time. She was still seeing her physio every second Thursday. The leg was better. Not gone, but better. On particularly cold mornings, she still moved carefully downstairs, holding the rail, aware of the specific weight of old injuries. Marcus Webb, she heard through a colleague, had started playing hockey again. His mother had sent a card to the unit the previous Christmas, the handwritten kind, the kind people still send when words feel insufficient. Mara kept it in her locker at work, tucked behind her water bottle, in a place she passed every day without making a point of looking. It was just there. Occasionally, she remembered it was there, and that was enough. The 4:47 a.m. call, the way her stomach had dropped, the way she'd driven through the dark to a building she couldn't leave without a key card, the way Calloway had looked at her like she was a version of the story he'd already decided. She thought about it sometimes. Not obsessively. Not in the way that kept her up at night. More in the way that a person thinks about the moment a branch cracked under them on ice, sudden and irreversible, except that this time they'd made it to the other side. She thought about Patricia's question in the corridor. What about the nurses who don't have a Terence? She didn't have a clean answer. She was trying to become part of one.